Yeah, we're only focusing on the. Is that showing?
Yeah, that's coming up.
On there it's showing like a mirror image. Okay, shows it correctly there. I'll just focus it more. But you're good. I'm just going to adjust the cameras.
There's a significant lag.
Yeah, I think that's due to it being, it's got to be recorded and then get to you and everything.
This technology is so amazing. I have more computing power in my pocket than when I was first using computers on my desk. Even more power than some mainstream computers were back in the 70s.
Absolutely. It's probably as good as I can. Looks pretty good.
We're all set then. Okay. Good evening. My name is Gary Waugh. I am the co-chair of the Litchfield Prevention Council. And tonight we are having a presentation on vaping given by the McCall Center for Behavioral Health. Andrew Lyon is going to be our presenter this evening. This presentation is in conjunction with school presentations that were done the last 2 weeks of April, in which we focused on the dangers associated with vaping. And we are hoping that you learn from this tonight. The Prevention Council is a group of 6 of us currently. We are looking for additional volunteers. So if you have the opportunity to join us and are interested in some of the materials that we sent out to you in the last few weeks on vaping primarily, we would love to have you attend our meetings at the second Tuesday of the month in the basement of St. Anthony's. So I'm going to introduce Andrew, and he is going to take you through their presentation, which has been very informative from what I've seen in the past. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Again, my name is Andrew Lyon. I am the Director of Prevention Services at the McCall Center for Behavioral Health. So at McCall, particularly in the prevention department, we focus on educating the community, parents, and children about the dangers of underage drinking, alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use. We use research-based strategies to prevent substance use and abuse, increase awareness, provide coping strategies and resistance skills, reduce family substance use, and strengthen family bonds. A lot of what we're going to talk about today will be housed in the realm of prevention, and you can't talk about prevention without talking risk and protective factors. So risk and protective factors can run the gamut of everything from individual factors all the way out to cultural and policy level issues. But there are, a number of ways we can sort of package some of these risk factors and talk about them in ways that we can, be productive and do something about it. So some of the big risk factors that we like to focus on when we talk about prevention, particularly for youth substance use, are things like family. So when when a child in a family or family members of the child, like parents, siblings, or extended family members, have a history of substance use, it's very often that child will have a predisposition to addiction and will be at a greater risk of substance use. So that predisposition might come in the form of a genetic predisposition or, something as simple as seeing the use and it becoming normalized in their daily life and being more likely to engage in that activity. A big one that we're going to talk about a little bit later also is age. The age an individual first uses a substance is a big indicator for their level of risk of developing an addiction as an adult. So the earlier someone starts using, say, alcohol, the more likely they are to have an addiction to alcohol as an adult. We're going to talk a little bit about neuroplasticity. You can't talk about substance use and addiction without talking about brain development. The majority of addiction starts before the age of 18 when there's a lot of development going on in a person's brain, and it is a huge, huge risk factor or an important player in talking about addiction. Again, the environment. Risk factors can range from a person's family life, the neighborhood they grow up in, the school they go to, their peers, their friends, and it really runs the gamut. So being surrounded by substance use on a daily basis really will increase an individual's risk for engaging in that activity and those behaviors. And then you also have mental health risk factors and learning difficulties like ADHD, anxiety, and depression, and then trauma and ACEs scores. We're going to talk a little bit about ACEs scores, but ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And there's a growing body of research to substantiate the important impact and consideration of ACEs on the development of addiction. And how trauma affects that. And so, there is a sort of sketch that you can follow to show how ACEs can lead to these high risk factors and, up to including early death. So, we can talk about things like if somebody grows up and they're in they're a person who has experienced or comes from a background that has experienced generational or historical trauma, that can increase the risks of the social conditions and the local context of their upbringing and their experience, particularly in early childhood. And that can lead to things like these adverse childhood experiences, the trauma they might face, growing up with maybe family members who have substance use disorders or addictions, or having family members who've been incarcerated or experiencing domestic violence as a child. And that can cause disrupted neurodevelopment. So what that means is that it will impact the development of the brain of the child who experiences those traumatic events, particularly early on in life, but really ACEs are cumulative. And so this disrupted neurodevelopment can lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, which can lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors. So again, health risk behavior is like early engaging in substance use, which can lead to disease, disability, and other social problems, and that can lead to early death. Another common risk factor that we like to talk about is perception of harm. It's one of those things that kind of seems obvious on, when you talk about it, but it can really have surprising effects. So the idea behind a low perception of harm is that if someone believes that something is not harmful, they're far more likely to engage in that. So we see here the effect of the perception of harm of regular marijuana use, or the perceived risk of regular marijuana use, and the number of students or percentage of students who report engaging in the daily use of marijuana. And so I don't know if the camera can pick up the little the red dot, but as the perceived risk goes down, you see the reported use go up. And then as the perceived risk goes up, reported use goes down. And you see that that effect trending pretty tightly. So, this is something that is why education around substance use and the real risks of substance use is important. And right now we're in a time where There is serious discussion around the legalization of adult recreational use of marijuana. And it's important to, even in the face of those policy discussions and decisions, to talk about the real risks of marijuana use and substance use, particularly on young people, and in really engaging in that discussion in a meaningful way about how that can really harm a young person's brain development. And again, we talked a little bit about this slide, shows the data that we have on that age of first use. So this particular graph is about a study done on the risk of alcoholism on the age of first drink. But we see this when the study is done for other substances, we see this repeated, whether it be marijuana, whether it be nicotine, whether it be opioids or prescription drugs. The earlier an individual begins engaging in substance use, the greater their risk. Looks like we lost a little tag here, but this represents their increased risk percentage for having an addiction as an adult. So adults who are surveyed, who are diagnosed with an alcohol use disorder, were asked when their first drink was, when they first started drinking. And what they found was before those who reported beginning their alcohol consumption at 13 or younger had an almost 50% higher risk of having also reporting an alcohol use disorder. And so what we see is that the longer an individual waits to begin drinking, the lower their risk for having a diagnosed alcohol use disorder is. So, there are a lot of reasons why something like alcohol consumption, the legal age of alcohol consumption is 21, and this is a big reason why. So, back in the 80s, in the Nancy Reagan era, a lot of prevention focused around just say no, around this DARE style of drugs are bad. And we know now that that approach to prevention wasn't really effective. So really now one of the big pushes in the prevention field is delaying the onset of use because of this. This is really, really, really one of the really important sticking points that we want to make, where the earlier an individual starts using substances, the greater the risk of developing a substance use disorder is. And I don't want to stick on this point too long, but we also know that the development of an addiction to one substance also increases the risk of developing an addiction to a number of other substances. And this is why nicotine and vaping are such an important thing to talk about now. So most of us know that e-cigarettes are really the new big thing. They were developed in the early aughts, late aughts, in China as a sort of, quote, healthier way to consume nicotine. The idea being long-term smokers could transition to get their nicotine consumption from these e-cigarettes that would presumably be healthier and less dangerous, less cancer-causing. But what we know is that, even though it was designed to be a health benefit for those 2-pack-a-day smokers, what happened was there was a big marketing vacuum, and it very quickly got adopted by young people. They were advertised with flavors and really sort of smart targeted ads for young people. And that quickly became one of the largest markets for e-cigarettes. So recent changes in youth vaping rates in the last few years. Thankfully, in 2020, e-cigarette use rates in youth are down, though there's a big asterisk to that. That may have something to do with the COVID-19 pandemic. But that being said, this only brings us back down to 2018 vaping rates. And the 2018 vaping rates marked a stunning increase in e-cigarette use. So even though 2019 was a peak, we're still at very alarming rates of young people reporting regular use of e-cigarettes. More than 3 million high school students and 550,000 middle school students reported recent use of e-cigarettes in 2020. Again, down from estimated 4 million high school students and 1.1 million middle school students in 2019. And I just want to put a little bit of context on that. In Connecticut and now nationally, the age to purchase tobacco products, including e-cigarettes, is 21. And I don't know a single 21-year-old middle school or high school student. So, even though, we've gotten some, wins, clawbacks in 2020 for e-cigarettes, this is still a product that is infiltrating high schools and middle schools all around the country. In 2011, less than 2% of high school students said they had ever used an e-cigarette, and by 2020, 20% had. And again, e-cigarettes are consistently the most used tobacco products among middle school and high school students. This comes in a time where we were just in the public health field and in the prevention field, just starting to celebrate these massive gains in eliminating cigarette smoking. But 2019 marked the first time in a 20+ year downtrend that we saw an uptick in high school cigarette smoking rates. So we're discovering, and really something we predicted for a long time, is that the introduction to this easy way of consuming nicotine is going to translate into people who have never smoked before a cigarette in their entire life using a vape and then picking up a cigarette. And so that's definitely one of the big concerns that we've known about vaping that we're starting to see bear out. Some more sort of updated news in youth vaping. The FDA now recognizes these statistics of youth vaping as epidemics. The use of vaping, as with other substances, has increased dramatically between the ages of 6th grade and higher grades, suggesting a key opportunity for intervention. So this is a perfect time for high schools and school districts around the country to really engage in innovative intervention strategies, in partnership with their local prevention councils. While pre-filled pods like the Juul style vape is still the most common vaping product, Juuls are starting to lose their traction and their popularity, and disposable e-cigarette use has increased over 1,000% between 2019 and 2020 because it's less regulated, it's harder to regulate, products are coming onto the market quicker than anybody can keep up with it. And it, particularly with flavors are more accessible through disposable e-cigarettes, and they just tend to be easier for young people to access and use. This presents both a concern around, obviously, the vaping problem, but then also the fact that while regulation on products like Juuls are increasing, the FDA is catching on and coming down on them, these disposable e-cigarette manufacturers are releasing products so quickly that regulators can't keep up. Nobody knows what's in them. And so we're getting that concern around just completely unregulated, unchecked products who, nobody really knows what they're consuming. In 2019, the prevalence of ever vape, so students who have ever used an e-cigarette, where typically in the prevention field, we measure regular use based on if you've used in the last 30 days. That tends to be a pretty good indicator of whether someone is a regular user. Students who have ever vaped among 8th grade students reached 25%, and 41% for 10th graders and 46% for 12th graders. So what we're seeing is in 2019, almost half of all 12th graders have used one of these nicotine-containing products. And then while the percentage of students who currently smoke at both the middle school and high school levels has decreased significantly, the percentage of students who use e-cigarettes has significantly increased during the same period. Youth who vape are 6 times more likely to start smoking traditional cigarettes compared to non-vapers. So again, we're just starting to see us lose traction on some of those cigarette smoking gains, thanks almost entirely to these e-cigarettes. So then the question is, why is vaping so popular? There's some big obvious ones, the flavors that target adolescents and younger populations. These products were originally designed to, quote, as a healthier cessation product for long-term smokers. But I don't know any 2-pack a day, smoker who is going to say, ooh, bubble gum, I'm going to use that instead. Or gummy bear, or candy cane, cotton candy, mango, creme brulee. Those were huge in really catapulting e-cigarettes to popularity among young populations. But then also these e-cigarette companies saturated youth-driven platforms. So social media platforms that were primarily used by young people were saturated with advertisements for these e-cigarettes. So on Instagram, Snapchat, and YouTube channels. The sale of vaping supplies to minors is banned across the country, but it's easily accessible online. It's really easy for a young person to just check that box and say, yeah, I'm 18, yeah, I'm 21, and get it shipped right to home. And then also for a long time, and even still now, there's misconceptions that it's not as harmful as smoking, and that you can control the amount of nicotine use, and that there is no secondhand harm. A lot of times those misconceptions or these ideas are very much exaggerated. Early on, a lot of people would say, hey, it's just water and flavoring. But, that's not accurate at all. Or that, propylene glycol, one of the main ingredients in a lot of vaping liquids is, deemed as safe to eat. But people forget you're not eating it, you're heating it up and inhaling it. And that's a completely different thing. And so, a lot of the education that we've done goes around, correcting a lot of these misconceptions. But back to the marketing part, this is a really interesting thing that a lot of e-cigarette companies, particularly Juul, put a lot of money in. Again, remember, while you're watching these, that these advertisements are intended to sell a product for someone who's at least 21 years of age, but really someone who's trying to kick a smoking habit, been smoking for a long time. That is not what I'm seeing in these ads. What I'm seeing in these ads is, this is a hip, cool thing to do. If you want to be young and cool and be popular in your high school, you need to be like me. And so a lot of money was poured into advertising, both traditional, like these sort of magazine style ads, but then also through social media platforms, and particularly utilizing social media influencers. So a social media influencer is someone who is, paid to promote something by just being popular. There's someone who has a popular YouTube channel or a popular Instagram channel, and a lot of, they might have millions of followers, so they're paid by people to advertise their products just because they have a platform. And so what clever e-cigarette manufacturers did was they approached a lot of these influencers and asked them to market their product. But they didn't ask them to market their product by going onto their platform and saying, hey, this Juul is really cool, you should all buy it. What they did was they paid them to just continue doing what they're doing, but do it while they're using a Juul. You don't have to talk about it. You just do the cool thing that you got popular doing while using your e-cigarette. And what happened is millions of 13, 14, 15-year-olds saw these social media superstars just casually using these products, being popular, probably being rich, and think, hey, I want to be like them. And one of the most prominent things they'd see is that e-cigarette. And it really helped to popularize these products very, very quickly. And so an influencer, a social media influencer that was paid by Juul was quoted in saying that they liked my edgy style and that it appealed to a younger market. Again, these products are designed to be a tobacco cessation product marketed to long-term smokers. I don't know why, if Juul was acting in good faith, they would want to target younger markets. And then also, memes just continued to popularize these products. So most of us are familiar with memes now, but really little simple, almost seemingly harmless things that just continued to hammer this cultural trend that vaping, Juuls, e-cigarettes are just a normal everyday thing. So I'd rather lose my Juul than lose you. It's kind of silly, but it kind of equates a Juul to a loved one, or an important relationship. Getting married with a Juul. Juul pods, 25 miles or water. And it really just continued to sort of hammer that trend that like, this is the cool thing, everybody's doing it. Get on with it, get like us. And so how are these messages harmful? Again, I think it really is just, hammering that cultural expectation that this is what we do. I don't know if you have thoughts.
I just wondered whether the advertising is more directed toward females or males at a particular age group.
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure much I'm not aware of any research that looked into, particular gender focus on advertising. I do know that, there have been studies done particularly on age targeting and how much money was put towards younger populations. But that's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I'm aware of any of research on that.
Do you think more males are users? I mean, in general?
I think typically, young boys are more likely to engage in riskier behavior quicker. But I don't know. It's interesting. I'd have to look back at some of our student surveys to really say definitively. But yeah, that's a really interesting question.
We have several people watching,
Sure.
so you might want to let them know about how they can chat, they can ask questions.
Oh yeah.
We'll respond. And also, if you would, when Gary or when the audience here ask questions, if you could repeat the question, then the people
Yes.
who are watching could hear the question.
Thank you. Thank you for the reminder. So for those of you who are watching, we do have a chat channel. I prefer to have these presentations to be more conversational. I feel like we tend to get more out of it when we do that. So please, please, please use the chat function. If you have any questions, comments, please leave them there. I'd love to answer some questions. And yeah, going forward, I'll make sure to repeat any questions that are asked from the audience. So thank you for those questions. And then just to sort of double down on some of the advertising and media focus that a lot of e-cigarette companies did was to try and distance themselves from tobacco companies. So what we know is that e-cigarettes deliver as much nicotine in the most non-invasive way to addict their customers. They introduced flavors to attract young people and to try and downplay the harms of these flavors. And they use marketing strategies like social media that are known to attract young people. Those all sound like strategies that major tobacco companies have always used. But Juul Labs tried their hardest to try and fight against that perception. So this is actually an ad that Juul Labs, the manufacturer of Juul, probably one of the largest and most well-known e-cigarettes ever. And they put this out saying that Juul Labs is not big tobacco. We are an independent vapor company on a mission to eliminate cigarettes. But what we know is that Juul Labs is big tobacco. The largest investor in Juul Labs is Altria Group, which owns Philip Morris, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, tobacco manufacturer on the planet. The makers of Marlboro have invested over $12.8 billion in Juul Labs, and that number actually might be a little bit dated. But we know is with the amount of money invested, the strategies they use to attract young people and create as many addictions as possible to their product, it's no different than tobacco companies. So, you know, there's a lot of, we're going to get a little bit more into a little bit sciencey on sort of, you know, nicotine and the addictive qualities of this. But this really, this one last sort of bit shows how they were trying to be really clever in hiding how much nicotine in it. So, you know, the 1.5 we have here are 3 different nicotine strength Juul pod options. Originally, the only pod option you had was a 5% nicotine strength. That was all you can get from Juul. But because of a lot of pushback around the nicotine content, Juul decided to start producing lower nicotine content e-cigarettes. But you know, even just that is really a deceptive strategy. So when you tell someone that something is 5% of something, you think, hey, that's not a lot. But what we found out is that the 5% nicotine strength Juul pod, which was the original product and for a long time the only one you could get, is the equivalent of just over 2 packs of cigarettes. And so in my time, you know, working in prevention, talking with students, it wasn't uncommon to run into students who would freely admit that they go through a pod a day. And so that means that's a high school student who's consuming the equivalent of 2 packs of cigarettes in nicotine a day. And you know, it really is a kind of, you know, a dangerous game that we're playing when we have young students and young people who are consuming these products, not realizing how harmful they are. And so there is a study done to show the nicotine consumption. I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead. I missed one point. Originally, e-cigarettes, before Juul came around, e-cigarettes were, you would get a refillable product with a tank that you'd go out and you'd buy what was called e-juice, and it would come in all kinds of different flavors with different nicotine concentrations. And so this was sort of an early ad that they put out to kind of let people know how much they should get. But what was used in these early cigarettes was called a free-base nicotine. And so free-base nicotine is a form of nicotine that is rough to consume. So you couldn't put too much nicotine in it because the more free-base nicotine in it, the more irritating it is to the throat, and so the consumer wouldn't consume as much. And so, you know, they had additives in these products, propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin that really helped to change. There was some soothing, and to help kind of offset that. But if you put too much free-base nicotine in this e-juice, it gets too rough and they can't consume it. And so part of the reason why Juul, in addition to their incredible marketing strategy and really the way they sort of handle their product, part of the reason why Juul became so big so quickly is because they were able to find a new way of delivering nicotine. They created a formulation that we call a nicotine salt. And nicotine salt is chemically formulated in a way that is significantly less irritating. So you can put more nicotine in your product and it's easier to consume, and you're consuming it quicker. And so that's part of the reason why you have these percentages that seem to be kind of all over the place, because you have different types of nicotine formulation. But what we know is that these different nicotine formulations absorb into the body in different rates. And so what we have here shows in the time after the first puff of the product, how much nicotine the body absorbs. And so what we have here is the blue line here is the free base nicotine. And so this is the original sort of vape juice, e-juice that you would get. And so it was hard to get a lot of nicotine, absorbed into the body through the nicotine salt. And so combustible cigarettes, they have this really kind of, huge peak and then sort of a quick drawdown. And so the e-liquid with a nicotine salt, which is what Juul came out with, very closely mimics the nicotine absorption of a cigarette. And so, this is something that, can be beneficial for their, public health side of saying, hey, we're trying to get cigarette smokers to transition to this, quote, healthier alternative, because it better, feels more like smoking a cigarette. But then they also created a formulation to get people addicted very, very quickly to their product. Because we introduced this concept of microdosing. So microdosing is when people consume smaller amounts of something, like a medication, for longer periods of time, rather than taking a large dose of all their medication at once. And so the benefit of microdosing is that you're able to maintain a certain level of, say, a medication in the body over a longer period of time. And it's easier to do that than to take one large dose, say, once a day. But when we think about the functionality of the way people smoke cigarettes versus the way people use e-cigarettes, is that microdosing is something that, is significantly easier with e-cigarettes. So typically, when an individual smokes a cigarette, they might be at work, they'll get up from their desk, they'll go outside to the designated smoking area, they'll smoke their cigarette, it might take them 2-3 minutes, and then they'll put the cigarette out and they'll go back to what they were doing. And so what will happen is their blood nicotine level will spike, and then it'll slowly trail off as their body metabolizes it, and it wears off until it gets to a certain point where then their body says, hey, you need more nicotine, go smoke another cigarette. But that might take some time. With e-cigarettes, what we're seeing is that you can do it. A lot of students have found a way to create no vapor. They'll take a hit, and they might blow into their sleeves, so it's not creating these puffs of smoke. They also taste pretty good. They smell pretty good, so it's something that's really attractive and enjoyable to use. And so what happens is that someone might take a hit of their e-cigarette and maybe not get as high a concentration of nicotine, but because they didn't have to disrupt what they were doing, they were able to just take a quick hit, put it down, continue doing what they're doing. Hey, that tasted good, or that felt good, or that gave me a good head rush. I'm going to take another hit in a much shorter time frame. And so their blood level is going to continue to rise, and then they're going to take another hit. And then maybe a couple minutes later, they'll take another hit. And so what we're seeing is young people who are just continuously dosing themselves with nicotine, and they're maintaining significantly higher levels of nicotine in their body. And this is really leading to, it's really reinforcing the addictive properties of nicotine, which we already know is an extremely, extremely, extremely addictive product, in the bodies of people whose brains are still developing. So they're still growing through a lot of neuroplasticity. That's still a huge role. What's going on in their body, and they're overdosing. There are students who are overdosing on nicotine. Nicotine overdoses can cause seizures, and it's not unheard of to hear about students who end up in the hospital because they've consumed far too much nicotine, and they've maintained blood nicotine levels at way too high a rate or a level for way too long. Do you have any questions?
No.
Okay. And then again, just to kind of hammer these studies. A study in January 2020 showed that rats who were exposed to Juul vaped nicotine, so nicotine salts, had higher levels of nicotine concentration in their blood compared to a number of other nicotine sources. So what the study did was they took the blood of rats 20 minutes after their exposure to approximately 10 puffs over a 5-minute period. So it's basically every 30 seconds, the rats would be exposed to a puff of either a Juul, a previous generation e-cigarette, so that freebase nicotine, a traditional cigarette, and then a control for air. And so what we're seeing is that, again, this is 20 minutes after the exposure. The blood level nicotine for the Juul is significantly higher than the freebase nicotine, which is just below the traditional cigarette. And then obviously the control is 0 nicotine. And then cotinine, that is an indicator, that's a metabolite of nicotine. So as the body starts to break down that nicotine, you start to see this cotinine in the blood. And so, again, just to reinforce this point, the way these products were not just marketed, but designed, they were designed to addict people. And when they're marketed to young people, you can't really say they weren't designed to addict young people. And then, so we're going to just really, really quickly hit, I mentioned it a few times, but the importance of brain development on addiction. So the brain develops over time in stages, and there are some really, obviously the whole brain is important, but there's some key important parts of the brain as they pertain to addiction. And the limbic system is one of the big parts, and there's a lot of important things to play here. But the limbic system is really, the reward pathway is really designed to reinforce evolutionarily beneficial behaviors. And so it's things like eating, like drinking water, like sleeping, like reproducing, things that are good for either keeping you alive or keeping the species alive. But addictive substances are addictive in part because they have a particularly potent effect on the reward pathway. And they are really good at convincing the body, particularly as your brain is developing, that, hey, this alcohol or this nicotine or this marijuana is just as important, if not more important, than food or water. And so, again, this is really, gets to that point of the age of first use. The earlier an individual starts using these substances, the easier it is for these substances to start interacting with the reward pathways, creating these pathways, and really kind of convincing the body that, hey, this substance is just as important as water. So, when you don't get enough of it, it kind of stops being a choice and starts to feel like a biological need. And a lot of that happens because of the way it impacts dopamine, and particularly the way nicotine interacts with and plays off of dopamine for really reinforcing a lot of the signaling that goes through your brain and impacts the decisions you make, and really your behavior overall. So we know that brain development happens through physical and chemical changes. The brain continues to develop through adolescence into early adulthood. Brain maturation is, some people say 21 to 25 to maybe even older. Boys' brains tend to develop, male brains tend to develop a little bit slower than female brains. And throughout that development, you're having a lot of growth, you're having a lot of pruning, a lot of neurological changes. Your DNA, particularly in your brain, is really more open to changes during this development process. And exposure to nicotine changes the DNA and the neural pathways and the chemicals in your brain in really, really deleterious effects and harmful ways. And so these changes can make the brain more responsive to effects of drugs in the future. So what that means is, this is sort of referring to something that I said before, an addiction to one substance primes the brain for developing an addiction to another substance. And so, again, if we can take anything away from this presentation, is that delaying the age of first use gives the brain more time to develop and become less changeable, and it reduces the risk for developing addiction. And so nicotine dependence and vaping's linked to depression. So, a lot of youth think that they're getting a low dose of nicotine for these products. When we talk about 5% nicotine strength, you think, hey, that's not a lot. But that is a lot. 5% nicotine strength is, as we said, a pot of that is equivalent to 2 packs of cigarettes. And a lot of these products, to different degrees, are not very well regulated. Nicotine can act as a dopamine imposter and artificially raise this feel-good chemical dopamine through your reward pathway. And because these chemicals are increasing the feelings of dopamine and serotonin, the body begins to decrease the amount it makes naturally, which makes it really difficult and unpleasant to quit nicotine. And this sort of gets to sort of the more chemical side of addiction and how it creates imbalance in the brain's chemical makeup, and really sort of reinforces that drive for needing that product. And then users quickly become dependent on nicotine to positively enhance their mood and to avoid unpleasant withdrawal symptoms, including irritability, anxiety, and stress. Actually, I want to stop here before we continue moving on. I don't know, anybody have any questions, thoughts?
Is the pattern of addiction, once it begins, does that make it more difficult to undo that pattern as time goes on? So if someone began, let's say, at 14 versus somebody beginning at 18 or 19, would it be more difficult to undo that as the person matured?
Yeah, so the question was, and to paraphrase, does addiction become more difficult, if addiction starts at 14 versus 16, is it more difficult to change? Addiction is a very complicated thing. There's, just talking about the effects on the individual, the physical exposure, that's one thing. But we also know that there's, a lot of other sort of factors that go into addiction, particularly with trauma and ACEs. And so, one person's addiction can and will always look very different than another person's addiction. So it's hard to sort of say universally whether, an addiction that started at 14 is more challenging than an addiction that started at 16. But, when we talk about brain development, the earlier the exposure is, the more cemented these pathways through the brain can be, the greater the predisposition and the risk for developing an addiction is. So in one sense, we can kind of say yes, but in another sense, depending on sort of the environmental factors and the cultural factors and the individual factors that have led into that addiction and are sort of feeding into it, you can't really say one way or another. But yeah, that's part of the reason why addiction is such an interesting thing to sort of study, is because it's so complicated and there's so many different sort of factors and nuances and, a lot of different ways that people need help, and, we can help people. So I hope that answered. Okay.
Andrew, you might remind people that they can chat with us and
Yeah.
questions up. there's a delay in this, so I'm looking at a screen that was minutes ago, so,
Oh, boy.
so we have to wait, but
Okay, thank you. I was just reminded to remind everyone who's watching, please feel free to use the chat box, ask questions. There is a not insignificant delay between what I'm saying and what you all watching on YouTube are seeing. So if there are questions that do come in, that I don't get to right away, I'm happy to take a moment and go back. So please feel free to leave questions. Right. I want to talk a little bit about COVID-19. We're in the pandemic. I'm wearing a mask currently in a socially distanced room on a hybrid presentation platform. In one way, it's really cool. In another way, COVID-19 really isn't cool, and that's the reason why we're doing it. But it also plays an important part in sort of the relevance of both vaping and youth substance use. So we know that COVID-19 has impacted the mental well-being of everybody, particularly young people. So the public health protections in response to COVID-19 have created a number of added social pressures for youth. Lack of peer interaction and increased social isolation have eroded many of the protective factors that youth rely on. Things like peer relationships and sports and academics and going to after school activities. A lot of those were really important protective factors that kept youth engaged in healthy activities and kept them away from a lot of substances. And so there are a couple of recommendations that the CDC and other health organizations have released to help support youth and parents during the challenging time. So some of these might seem obvious, some of these maybe not so much, but all of these are relevant to prevention and preventing youth substance use. So one is to try and maintain as normal a routine as possible. Talk, listen, to and encourage expression of particularly young people. Give honest and accurate information. You want to teach simple steps to stay healthy, be alert for any change in behavior, and reassure adolescents about their safety. A big reason why many young people start using substances is coping with anxiety, depression, perceived mental health concerns, perceived or real mental health concerns. And COVID-19 really kind of leaned into a lot of the stressors that, young people feel, young people may choose to self-medicate for. So it's really important that we try and both address the substance use concerns, but then also these risk factors like these stressors and anxiety that can drive youth to choose to use. And then also there's a physical side to COVID-19. COVID-19 is a respiratory illness, and when we talk about vaping, we're talking about inhaling things into the lungs. So a 2020 Stanford University School of Medicine study found that youth who vape are 5 to 7 times more likely to have contracted COVID-19. We know that smoking and e-cigarettes increase an individual's risk of developing respiratory illnesses. Both smoking and vaping impact immune function in the respiratory tract, and that increases not only the risk of contracting COVID-19, but also experiencing worse health outcomes from COVID-19 and other respiratory illnesses. Lung damage from vaping compounded by contracting an acute respiratory illness like COVID-19 can increase the risk of poor health outcomes overall. And just quickly mentioning, at the very beginning of COVID-19, there was a really popular rumor that people thought that smoking actually reduced your risk of contracting COVID-19 because there was a study that allegedly showed that nicotine might be a protective measure against contracting COVID-19 because of the way it interacted with what was called the ACE2 inhibitor. But, that was quickly shown to be not true, and obviously the opposite is true. So ultimately, we want to talk about youth substance use, concern around that, prevention, but then also, what do we do when there are young people who are struggling with this? What does problematic use look like? So it's important to acknowledge that addiction can happen at any age and that there is no one type of person. We've done a lot of work in the prevention field to address stigma around addiction, around substance use disorders, and really address a lot of the misconceptions, but it's still, this perception that clings on, that there is a type of person who, develops addiction, or, not my kid, I have a good kid, or, oh, it's my friend, my kid's friends are bad, or whatever it may be. But, it's important to acknowledge that there is no one type of person who can develop an addiction. But there are indicators that we can look for. So one big indicator is that a person continues to use even when it's harming their life. So that might be impacts to their physical health, to their school achievement, to their relationships, particularly if they feel like they can't stop. That's a big indicator for addiction. Other things you might want to look out for is your young person or loved one might be hanging out with a different group of friends. They might not be caring about their appearance. They might be getting lower grades in school, missing classes, or just skipping school altogether. They may be losing interest in their favorite activities or getting in trouble at school or with law enforcement. They might be having different eating or sleeping habits, and having problems with family members or friends that may be out of the norm. And so, what you want to do if you are concerned, identify the problem, identify that there is a concern, and have that conversation. Let them know that you're concerned and that you care for them. You want to avoid lecturing them and be prepared to listen. You want to make it a comfortable conversation and foster an environment where they will feel comfortable coming to you. Addiction is a very difficult thing to deal with. A lot of times people don't acknowledge or recognize that that they may be struggling with a substance use disorder. And sometimes coming at them too aggressively may push them further away or further into trouble. So it's important to be supportive for that individual. No resources in the community. McCall has a number of resources and opportunities for both young people and adults to really help engage with, either treatment or maintaining recovery. Youth service bureaus. Right here, this is the link to the Torrington Youth Service Bureau, but there are youth service bureaus all over the state that a lot of them have great resources. Local prevention councils, great resources to connect to. So if parents are concerned about their young person, reach out to your local prevention council. They'll know a lot of the resources. And then there are also a lot of online resources, particularly now during COVID, but there are a lot of kind of really ingenious ways to engage young people who might be trying to quit, especially vaping. So there's a text to quit line, smokefree.gov, and I could fill up 30 slides with available online resources, but it's out there. And then when that you have the conversation, the resources, make sure that you have consequences to that. Doesn't mean they're in trouble. It doesn't mean you yell at them or whatever, you distance yourself, but you want to be supportive but firm. It's important to set boundaries and expectations. Rules setting in the house is a big protective factor for young people. And you also want to talk about the potential risks. One of the big traps in prevention that happened for a long time is scare tactics. A lot of people thought, hey, I'm going to scare you. This is your brain on drugs, and what have you. Scare tactics typically don't work in the way they're intended. So you want to talk about the prevention or the actual risks, but in a way that you're not trying to scare them. It's just, you're trying to have a conversation about your concern, and that you really care about them, and then follow through, help them along the way. And so you can start that conversation by, educating yourself, talk early and often. A lot of times parents are afraid to start talking about their concerns until it's too late and the concern is happening. So you can start these conversations at a young age. Ask them about what they know or think. You can find teachable moments. So in fictional characters, movie stars, athletes, classmates and relatives. You can also use these teachable moments to talk about substances in an abstract way with young children who may not fully understand it, but talking about a lot of these risk factors. When we talk about substance use prevention, it's not always about the drug. Most times it's about the risk factors. It's about the social dynamics. It's about having healthy relationships and coping skills, and building that resiliency, so that when that person is faced with a stress that they perceive to be insurmountable, they have the tools equipped that were reinforced from a young age that they don't feel the need to cope with a substance. You also want to use positive communication, active listening, I statements. Avoid judgment. Addiction can be a very tough thing for someone to come to grips with, to admit to, and to talk about. It can be very shameful. They might feel a lot of shame about their situation. So you really, really want to be supportive and non-judgmental. And then also keep in mind the development of the teenage brain, particularly obviously when you're talking about teenagers. With the delayed development of the prefrontal cortex, a lot of the decision making, that risk reward, it's not there, and it's not their fault. They just physically don't have the development and the practice that many of us adults have, with being able to measure risk and reward, delayed gratification. And so it can be significantly more difficult for young people, particularly teenagers, to really sort of think through that. And then also, we talked very, very briefly about how rule setting can be a big protective factor for young people. But what's also important is to include children and young people in these rule setting and consequences. But then also, some other cool sort of tactics that I've heard about with developing sort of coping strategies and protective strategies for young people is finding clever ways to communicate and get ways out. So we all know peer pressure is a big thing that young people have to deal with in school. Things like, hey, just text me X, just the letter X if you want me to come and pick you up. So you don't have to tell your friends that you don't want to do it. You just text me, I'll come pick up. I'll be the bad guy as the parents say, you got to come home, something happened. So you don't have to say no to your friends, or you feel unsafe and I'll come get you. That's just one of many sort of, ways that, parents can kind of, consider how to approach these conversations with their young people. And then with that, my contact, again, I'm Andrew Lyon, McCall Center. Happy to answer any questions, comments, concerns, either here or if you want to email me, give me a call, and talk some things out. But yeah, we want to be a resource for everyone in the area in a lot of the prevention work, and particularly supporting Litchfield Prevention Council in what you're doing in this community. So with that, I am...
Andrew, you talked earlier about the going into the schools, our public schools here in town, and having conversations with the children that were watching this in a virtual setting. What were some of the concerns that you heard from the children regarding vaping and the dangers associated with it?
So I didn't deliver those presentations directly, but some of the concerns that were reflected to me deal a lot with. So what we're seeing now is that we're kind of getting past the point where young people don't know about these things, and now they're starting to ask really informative and challenging questions about why is this even allowed. I've been asked a lot of questions around, if these products are so dangerous and so addictive, why are they even allowed to be sold? These are questions coming from middle school students that, to answer these questions, we have to kind of engage with higher level cultural and legal concerns. I'm definitely seeing a lot of young people who are very informed about these things, and they're becoming concerned.
Now, do you have those resources, those people who can deliver those answers, like an anthropologist or someone who specializes like anthropology or cultural anthropology, so they don't have to overstep on those biases? Or do you work alongside of people who could actually help you guys with that?
Yeah, so the question is whether or not we work with people who have the resources to these questions. So not directly, but it can be kind of a challenging thing to talk about, particularly when you get into the legal aspects of it. There are, politics can be dangerous to kind of talk about in most contexts, and particularly when a lot of our funding streams come from federal sources. We need to be careful about approaching some of the more controversial aspects of why laws are and how to sort of talk about them. When we do talk about it, it definitely depends on the age of the students. Some older high school students, we might talk about some historical context around some of these laws, but a lot of times, a lot of these questions that I get from students can be so nuanced that it would, require 15, 20-minute conversation to really dig into, which I would love to do. But, that eats into, that eats into school time and the classroom time. So, it's a balance there. All right.
There's no questions from the virtual audience. You might remind them again, this is now the time.
Yeah. So now is the time to ask any lingering questions if anybody who's watching online has them. I know there's a slight delay, but I'll be here for a little bit just to make sure that we can capture any questions. And again, feel free to take down my contact information, my email, if anybody has any questions they want to shoot to me, anything that occurs to them, maybe, later tonight or later in the week, please feel free to reach out to me. Again, I'm Andrew Lyon, and happy to answer anything.
You want to say something to wrap up and get all those volunteers?
Sure.
Thank you, Andrew. We here in the audience at the community center learned a lot through this presentation, and hope that is true for those of you that joined us virtually as well. The Prevention Council is working hard to educate our audience in the community. Children, certainly a lot of our focus is on the public schools, but also the parents that raise these children and guide them in a very important way toward healthy adult lives. So if you have the opportunity and you have the time and you have especially something that will help us in this mission and are willing to contribute that time, we meet the second Tuesday of every month, and we're going to try to go in a in-person meeting in the month of June on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. Again, we need your resources. We need your enthusiasm, and we look forward to working with you. So thank you, Andrew, and thank the call center for an excellent presentation.
Yeah. Absolutely. So it's myself and then.
Good day, we're done.
So, yeah, we'll definitely get together and talk about some logistics. Also, I appreciate that.
Thanks for the question. We wanted that female voice in there. That's great.
Hello,
Thank
worried
you.
about. Sorry that I'm late. Tonight has been a busy night. I've been on the road all night tonight, so.
We had as many as 5 and as few as